there. Welcome back, everybody, to Robin Hanson's Interintellect Salon. This is semi-special because I'm hosting it myself, but Robin knows me as an attendee at these salons, and I usually have a lot of questions. So now I just get to ask them without interrupting anybody or being in the way of any other speaker. Not that I do that, but as a host, you always have the prerogative to ask first. Another reason to host Interintellect Salon, guys. This episode of Robin Hanson's Interintellect series will focus mainly on Robin's writings on hidden motives, hidden agendas, and his book. Hang on, I will take a photo of you. Do you want to hold it again? 1 second. Hold it. That's amazing. Wait a minute. It was Elephant in the Brain, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life, which you co-wrote with Kevin Simler, prolific blogger, basically somebody who explained to us how COVID will spread because COVID even happened. So maybe he's also possesses some kind of prophetic power. You will know more about this being his co-author. The 2010s were replete with books on gut feelings, moral foundations, hidden agenda. Everybody from evolutionary psychologists to religious scholars tried to explain to us whether the Freudian worldview that dominated the 20th century, whereby we're driven by these indecipherable desires and repulsions, withstands the probing of science. And in your book, through your book and through what Kevin and you found, it seems like it kind of does. Like we seem to be living in a kind of split consciousness. But very innovatively, your book also argues that we are highly incentivized to hide our motivations from each other, but also from ourselves. I think Trivers has a really interesting book, The Folly of Fools. And now that I was revisiting your book, I was often reminded of his, notes from a biological angle that there is an evolutionary benefit to lying to ourselves and deluding ourselves because we will be somehow more efficient or generative of more cooperation from our peers. So I just want to kind of take a historical tour here in 2010s and talk, or maybe even the aughts, and talk a little bit about the maybe 20 years that led up to the writing of this book, how it all started. So the aughts were the era of less wrong essays where it's hard to remember, but we were not always so well versed in Bayesian thinking and priors and mental models. These actually kind of started spreading out of academia into the blogosphere and then into public consciousness and colloquialisms in those 2 decades leading up to the writing of this book. So I just would like to hear a little bit from you about that. And if our attendees, if you were there and remember, please feel free to jump in, interject. We will take a moment to kind of reminisce in the salon. And welcome, Robbie. Welcome back.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can see me and hear me. Let me know if you can't. I guess I want to reframe Anna's introduction a little bit and see if she agrees or not. I recently went back and started reading some stuff on modernism, which fed into Freudianism. And a century and a half ago, even, there was whole movements and sets of thinkers who decided they had become aware that they had different motives than they thought. They weren't as secure in their values. They were trying to reconsider things. Certainly Freud make a lot of people think about that we can't really trust our own perceptions and feelings. And then in the last few decades, many psychologists, including evolutionary psychologists, have made this a truism, really, that we're often deceived and wrong about our motives. And I feel like it's this deceptive thing where we think we've got it covered because we know that fact where we really don't. So think about, say, biases in Bayesian reasoning or something. Many people like to go collect this list of standard cognitive biases. And when they know all the items on the list and can name them, they think, okay, I fixed them all. I'm not subject to any of these biases because I can name them all. And that's just remotely true. It's an entirely different thing to actually be able to get rid of these biases than just to be able to name them. And I think it's also entirely just there's all these people who, in the abstract, think, yes, we don't really know our motives very well, we can't really trust them. But then, as soon as you get away from that abstract discussion to anything concrete like politics or medicine or education, they completely forget that and just go back to the usual assumptions they have about their motives. And so that's what I think is still revolutionary about our book. That is, we took this abstract discussion about how our motives could be misleading and how you might not know what your motives are, and then applied that to 10 more concrete areas of life to say in each of those areas, and here is how you're wrong about your motives for school. Here is how you're wrong about your motives for medicine. Here's about you're wrong with your motives for charity, one by one. And I would claim that the world is still mostly ignoring those facts about how we could be wrong about those motives. The people who specialize in studying charity, the people who specialize in studying medicine, education, politics, they consistently take the usual naive claim we make about our motives and just run with that in all of those areas of study. So that's a way in which, even if our book is, gives you nostalgia about the old days when people talked about these things more, it's still pregnant with possibility in the sense that if you would just get past the telling yourself that because you know in the abstract you might be wrong about your motives, you don't have any problem, and therefore you can just make the usual assumptions elsewhere, that's just not true. You actually have to do some work to go one by one through the areas of life and ask, what do I think my motive is here? And then ask, is that right? And what you will find if you do that work is that, in fact, quite often you'll find reasons to believe that your motive that you were assuming is just not true. And our book is intended to be a help to you in that process. Our main recommendation is that, look, it doesn't work very well for you to look inside yourself and say, what's my real motive? Try to remember how you felt about things. You can't see inside yourself. The thing inside yourself that wants to hide things is just way more powerful than this conscious thing that you're trying to fight it with. You're just going to lose this battle. I'm sorry. The way you can win is to ignore yourself, look at the world of other people, look at their weird behaviors about medicine and school and charity, etc., and try to come up with the best summary you can of what best explains everybody else's strange behavior, which is different, as I think you'll find more likely to believe, than what they say about it. Look at other people, what they say about the motives, and then what they seem to actually be doing. Notice the best theory of their behavior differs from what they say. And then when we get back to you, honestly, just assume you're not that different from other people, because you're really not. Sorry. You're not a unique flower that's never been seen in the universe before. You are a flower from a species that there have been billions of other flowers from the species from. So your apple doesn't fall that far from your tree. So that's my quick introduction here. So that's not, so you asked, like, where did I come from this? I'm an economist. I used to be a physicist and computer scientist, and then became a social scientist, first in political science and finally in economics. And social science is full of us trying to understand different worlds of life, including education and medicine and politics and charity. And as social scientists, we usually just take the usual story everybody says about why they do things, like you give to charity to help people, you go to school to learn something useful, you go to the doctor to get well. We just usually take people's standard story about these things and just accept them, and then try to elaborate that story in order to explain all the various weird puzzles that we see about these things. And I was a social scientist learning that world, trying to, struggling to make sense of all the weird things. And then I realized, after reading a bit about evolutionary psychology, actually as an immediate prompt, that I could consider other explanations. What if I didn't take people at their word for why they went to school or went to the doctor or gave to charity or voted in an election? What if I looked at my menu of other plausible explanations for why people do things and asked, do any of these other ones fit better? And my first exercise there, I had a health policy postdoc for 2 years after getting my PhD at UC Berkeley, where I, collaborated with political scientists and sociologists and economists all. And I just took those 2 years to first immerse myself in the details of medicine and health policy and our behavior there, and realize it just doesn't fit very well all with our usual story. And then entertain the idea, what if this was really signaling, ways we show off and show that we care? And that just made a lot more sense of all these weird things we do in medicine. And once I had a first case of just assume there's a different motive here than people say, and I could make more sense of something that way, now my eyes were open to consider that hypothesis in lots of other areas of life. And I have in the decades since I first, this postdoc was actually in 97 to 99. And in the years since then, seen that this hypothesis works for understanding many other things. And then it came together in this book published in 2016 in the aughts, as Anna says. And then, yes, it was of a piece of many other sort of think style, examine your motives, examine your thinking sort of things people were doing then. But again, most of that stays in this abstract world of examining your thinking, and it doesn't really penetrate into the other assumptions we make about our world. And again, I still think there's a revolutionary potential here for rethinking how we do most everything else in the light of the fact that we, in fact, don't know our motives very well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, your introduction was much better than mine. To me, one of the reasons why Freudianism still is so interesting is because I feel that it's maybe modernity really was, or modernism was the kind of gateway drug to Freudianism. But I mean, the whole kind of Christian thesis of the soul is that, we are sinners, and then you know what the sins are, and you confess, you stop sinning, and then you gain redemption and go to heaven. And then Freud came in and was like, no, because you don't actually know what you're doing. So there's no, the
Right.
redemption is through the couch of the psychoanalyst, and you need 15 years to really fully understand yourself. And then you can maybe start understanding why you're doing what you're doing, and kind of like categorizing and deciding whether they are bad or not. And in some sense, this is a disempowering feeling, right? Because you no longer have a little prayer book that tells you what's wrong with you. You actually have to go and as an individual find out. And people are still doing this. I am on your side here. I always tell people that, statistically, I am the least interesting person compared with the world. Like, there's no way that you as a person are more interesting than the outside world. And so it always makes more sense to kind of start outside. I know this goes against a lot of self-care, self-love, self-help narratives, but I don't care. I just don't think that they are correct. But I'm really interested in this notion that, in some sense, the whole less wrong rationality movement is, to me, the dialectical response to Freudianism. It's like saying that actually whatever is going on in your subconscious is not so mysterious. And whether
my parents were evangelical Christians who actually not only later ran a church, but earlier, when I was 1 year old, I was on the boat back from Australia where they had been missionaries. So I'm very immersed in the Christian tradition. And maybe it's a rearrangement of it, but at least when I was taught the Christian tradition, it's full of this idea that sin makes you not see things clearly. That so maybe that wasn't there before and they reinvented, but I think many even biblical passages have this idea that you're just not seeing what's important. You're so distracted, even like, the rich man can't get into heaven very easily because he can't go through the eye of a needle, or that you're just distracted with all the cares of the world and you don't see what's important spiritually or whatever. But there is this idea that somehow you aren't seeing clearly. Your vision is blocked by your obsession with your sins or your selfish concerns or your fears, and that Christianity is to a substantial degree about the idea that if you would only see more clearly, let God or whatever change how you see, then you would see things very differently. What seems important would become much less important, and what seems now peripheral would become central. There is this idea that sin makes you not understand or see the world around you clearly. And that's something that fits better with Freudianism as well, because Freud's also saying, look, you're just not seeing things clearly. But Freud, instead of sin doing it, it was your defense mechanisms, which look a lot like sin. Basically, defense mechanisms are you don't want to accept some truth, and so your mind distracts you from it and hides it and puts something else in its place. And in that sense, it's kind of like a sin. Freud basically said your inclination to sin is what makes you not see yourself and people around you clearly.
So maybe we could agree that whatever the dominant narrative of an era, humans are always concerned with their behavior and their motivations. In the past 20 years, we've been reading books that explain to us ourselves in a way that we find to be empowering. It makes us feel more in control to take on the world. Sorry, just somebody's stuck outside. Let him in. And these days we try to understand ourselves through science, and we actually manage to merge different schools.
But again, the key thing I want to point out is that when you're sitting in a pew in church and the pastor says that you're sinning, what you do is you look inside yourself and your recent emotions and feelings, and you ask, am I being honest with myself? Am I being emotionally open? And when you're sitting on the therapist's couch, you're also similarly asking, am I being honest? Am I being emotionally open? And you're segregating that part of your life, the part of your life on the pew and the part of your life on the couch, from schools and hospitals and factories and all the other parts of the world that you have these assumptions about, and you just don't consider that those perceptions and assumptions could be at all influenced by these personal feelings you're focused on in terms of are you being honest with yourself about your relationship or your career or your childhood or whatever.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop here for a second just to talk to invite people to participate in the historical retrospective before we move on. If you have a comment, question, jump in or raise your hand, please. Hi, Eloy. Hi, John. John, take the floor.
Robin, in terms of the history, I guess as a step towards the trajectory that you're on now, I know in your recent, well, first just a comment about the history to see if you would agree. So you mentioned the elephant in the brain, you mentioned Freud, the unconscious, you mentioned the notion of sin, but there are also
sorry, I mentioned those things. Robin is innocent. I brought up those things.
They're the French moralists. So Pascal, La Rochefoucauld, they had they tried to identify very specific ways in which we hide things from ourselves, in which our motivations elude us. They tried to do it with some precision and subtlety rather than a simple theory of the unconscious or an evolutionary psychology, signaling as a mechanism or motivation or that would explain everything. So I just thought I'd mention that as part of the historical tableau. My question is that I noticed in recent work you've been concerned with cultural evolution in addition to evolutionary psychology. And my question then is, since you've started to explore this additional framework or paradigm, how does it change your thinking about signaling and its scope, about behavior in sort of the sacred areas of society, education, medicine, and so on? I have to say, just before I give you the floor, you've had conversations with Scott Alexander. Then there's Brian Kaplan's work about medicine. There's Brian Kaplan on education. And what I take from those exchanges is that what you're getting at is a piece of the puzzle, a large piece, but that there are other motivations too. So that medicine is maybe a chunk of it, in good part, also about wanting to get well. At least that's what I took from your exchange with Scott Alexander. And Brian Kaplan would be the first to grant that signaling's a big piece of education, maybe not that big in not as big in engineering. Well, you see where I'm going with all of this. So the
Sure.
cultural evolution, how, maybe sometimes introspection and the standard motivations have some real bite. How far would you take the hermeneutics of suspicion? Does this undermine? You have such a wonderful natural relation with our host. How can that be possible if you're 100% correct? You couldn't have this. You couldn't have this quality interaction with other people if you're only and always operating with one theory or another of the hermeneutics of suspicion. So there.
I love this, John. Can I just propose something before we go into the response? Can we just pause, Robin, for a moment to talk about what signals are? Because maybe there are attendees who are not familiar with the term in the way that you talk about it. And let's talk about the sacred stuff a bit after, separately.
Okay.
Thank you.
So to respond to the prompt, when we ask what are our real motives, I just said they aren't what we usually say, but I didn't say much about what they could be. But a menu of plausible social motives that explain many kinds of behaviors that are different than what you think they are. One of them is showing off. So signaling is basically showing off. You can show off how smart you are, how rich you are, how conscientious you are, how loyal you are, how attached, how well you know somebody. These are all things that we want to show off and that we do indirectly through the other things we do. And that's one of our motives. And it covers a lot of different things, our motives to show off. But we also, again, want to show off loyalty. So a great deal of our actions are in order to bind us together with others and to create a shared sense of purpose and a sense of shared trust. And that's what loyalty signaling does. And that's another big part of what we do. So, if you ask, how can I get along with Anna here? Well, presumably my evolved instincts are going to be trying to get you and her to like me and trust me and to feel like I'm on your side and that we share important things. That's why we get along often, is because we're going so far to signal those things, as opposed to, if we're talking about some topic, there's the text of the topic, but often the subtext of the conversation is, do we trust each other? Do we like each other? Do we respect each other? Etc. And that's why, by focusing on those things in the motives of our conversations, we do achieve smooth, friendly interactions with people.
I also felt like one of the things that really, really struck me this time around was, and maybe this is just because something is on my mind or we had other Interintellect salons around this topic, was the question of trust. And the fact that it seems to me that when an individual consciously or unconsciously decides to hide their motivations from themselves or from others, the thing that we will be trading off with is trust. Trust in ourselves, right? Like I need to think that I understand myself in order to be really able to trust myself. For those of you who are athletes here, you know that you need to trust the abilities of your body to make choices, often in a nanosecond whilst you're doing sports. But that's the same for behaviors as well. And I'm wondering that since 2018, that when this book came out, Robin, you've written so much, and indeed you've expanded into different areas in your research and thinking, and we will talk about those. Have your views on trust in a group setting, one-on-one, in oneself, have your views changed about it?
Well, we did a recent episode of this series on the sacred, and I'd say the sacred is a way that we have a hidden motive that I didn't understand as well in 2016 when I wrote this book, and that is certainly related to trust. That is, when I was writing The Elephant in the Brain, I was thinking about relatively specific concrete signals that I might send to you, like I'm listening to you, I see your emotions, I remembered what you told me last time about your family. These are all ways I can signal that I care about you and that I'm attending to you. If I show off a big vocabulary, I show I know a lot. So I was mostly focused on these relatively specific, not very context dependent signs I could give you about my trustworthiness and interest and abilities. But the sacred is this package of behaviors and signals that works together as a package, but it's a little more complicated to analyze. And it makes sense that I wouldn't think about it when I was first thinking about signaling. But now that I understand the sacred as this powerful package, I can see how it works to produce trust. That is, people basically, in order to trust other people, they want to feel like they see the same things as sacred. And that's, if you see something as sacred and I see it together, say, if we go back to the Bayesian rationalists, whatever, look, they saw rationality as sacred and they bonded together over the fact that they both appreciated the very strong importance of rationality. That was not only a way to be rational, it was a way to bond together, to trust each other through the sense that there was a shared sense of what was sacred, i.e. rationality. And there are still, that community still exists to some extent, and we could talk about maybe what it's evolved into, but I didn't appreciate then the degree to which that was a thing. And honestly, I'm doing an event tomorrow on the myth of left and right, and even today I just realized that one of the explanations for why we think there is a coherent difference between left and right when there really isn't is that we're treating it as sacred. We are in fact bonding over this idea that instead of bonding just as a group, we have this thing outside ourselves we think that we both see and agree on, which is the fundamental left-right distinction. And that's, again, we trust each other on the same side of our political factions because we think we see this thing together as sacred. And that's hiding from us the fact that what it's really doing is bonding us together. So I honestly, thinking about that and reading my notes from my book again, there's a website, elephantsandbrain.com, where I have an outline. And basically, I think the highest level fact is we humans often do a lot of social things while we're looking away at something else, pretending we're doing something else. We are just pretty uncomfortable with being directly social in the sense of directly showing each other that we're loyal to each other, that we are trying to show off, that we are trying to bond. We hate the idea of saying that out loud and saying that directly. We would much rather bond and come together and like each other over something else that we're looking at together.
Like Interintellect salons.
For example, yes.
Your book, right?
Right. So here we'll all look and talk about the book, but what we're really doing here is bonding in the way humans always do.
The whole Interintellect idea that you can't talk about certain things directly, but if it's about Turgenev, you can talk about your deepest secrets and it will all feel much lighter and somehow less violent. But I'm wondering, do you see sacred as kind of outsourced signal? So we make something extra somatic. So for instance, I don't know, in the education chapter, I don't have to prove to you how smart and bureaucratical I am. I can just tell you that I went to Harvard, right? So it's like my signal is performed by something else to a large group of people.
Exactly. So, we don't want to say I went to school to get a good job. That's why basically we want to say I went to school to study this topic I was interested in, and then I learned a lot about it. That's why you should hire me.
I can't say that. It's not that I don't want to. I can't.
Well, it will look bad if I say it, and I will send the wrong signal to say it. So fundamentally, this is the puzzle. Why there's all these things we're doing as humans. Why aren't we consciously aware of them? Why can't we just admit them? And the meta answer is basically because it looks bad. The people who would be willing to say these things explicitly and be consciously aware of them, that tends to be correlated with unwelcome correlates. We don't like those people. And that's why, so that's a warning basically for all this thing we're talking about here. Look, we can all do that here together, but you will put people off if you talk about these things with other people. They will want you to be honestly intuitive. So, for example, look, if you're on a date, for example, you're not supposed to talk about, gee, I like here being on a date with you. I like you. It's not supposed to be the main topic of conversation. You're supposed to talk about the food or movies or something else. You both know implicitly this is about do you like each other, but you're not supposed to directly talk about it. And somebody who does look awkward and not very desirable as a date.
But then we will watch movies where people talk openly about it and are moved and wish
And then we'll be moved
we don't
by the
actually want to have
artistic
it.
expression of the movie
Yeah.
itself.
We just want the catharsis. But I'm wondering how much this has to do, or how much this is kind of how much your work around common knowledge led to this, right? Because in your common knowledge theory, you have this question of alignment. Basically, your theory of sacredness is, if it's outsourced signal, it kind of presupposes that we agree on some stuff, right? That the same external source will mean similar things to us, so that we don't have to directly, like, we can assume that I know, but the other person also knows the same thing. Do you see that as a linear thing that somehow?
Right. Well, so a lot of the things we're doing, we pretend like we're trying to make them easy, but we're often trying to make them hard enough that not everybody can do them, exactly to sort people by who can and who can't do them. So, like for the sacred, the generic scenario is you and I have seen the sacred tree. You and I know about how beautiful and special the sacred tree is. I know that you were there. I saw the tears in your eyes when you were there at the sacred tree dance. And so that bonds you and I together in a way that other people around aren't bonded because they haven't seen the sacred tree and they don't get it. And that's its function here, is to make you and I feel special with respect to each other. And we trust each other in a way that we couldn't if you and I just agreed to like each other and trust each other. There's a sense in which if you're the only person in the world who really gets the sacred tree, you could betray me terribly and I might still stick with you because I need someone to be around somebody who gets the sacred tree. Where if we were only bonding over the fact that we had agreed to sort of cooperate and work together, you betray me and it's over. I don't need you anymore. And so there's a sense in which the sacred can let people bond in ways. And all of these other hidden motives are powerful and there for reasons. And honestly, if you deny these, reasons, you'll be in trouble. So for example, for medicine, which is where I started, we use medicine to show that we care about each other. So if you'll realize that medicine isn't actually that effective. So if you have a family and you say to your family, look, I've done this research and medicine isn't really very effective, so I'm not going to buy very much for you. It's this is just the best thing for all of us. They will think you don't care about them. And they will think you're just trying to be cheap because people who care try to get each other a lot of medicine. And if you say, I know medicine's not very effective, but I know you take it as a signal, so I'm just to make sure you get a medicine to show I care about you, but I don't think it helps very much. Even that will look bad compared to the associate who says, I love you so much and I care so much about you. I'm going to make sure you get the very best medicine to make sure you never die because I love you so much. That person will be more trusted and bonded. So it's hard actually to be honest about any of these hidden motives because they serve a function in our lives in terms of being sacred things that show key motives that we're trying to show to each other.
I loved your note about the betrayal because it reminds me how, in absence of anything sacred holding people together, you have this situation that many millennials and Gen Z people will complain about living in big cities, the Tinder date, people dropping in and out of jobs, like people flee at the first conflict. The first thing doesn't go the way it's supposed to go, and there's nothing underneath holding you together. Whereas if you think that your church, giant tech company where you work, your village, the sacred tree, whatever is sacred, then the other person errs and you might stick around. And that in a weird way, while it's constraining around something, it is also liberating in terms of breadth of behavior and experience. If you only have one shot with people, which is, I think, the experience of many young people today, then you can only do one thing, basically. And if you start showing your colors, the other person might be like, nope, that's too much. Ilo, you have had your hand up so long and you're so patient. We're going back to Washington, D.C. to you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, and nice to meet you, Robin. I just wanted to I have had a few questions, two questions particularly. The first one was to talk about signaling, right? And the thing about signaling is that generally, and in the past, this signaling was done face to face through very localized groups, or through institutions like bureaucracies or communities that were you actually got to see face to face who are you signaling to. So my question would be, how do you think the social media explosion has changed the dynamic of signaling? And do you think that there is some sort of like Gresham's law, like there is some like the bad signaling is just crowding out, is just getting the good signaling out, right? And that's the first question. The second question would be, long time ago, I was an R-shirt Freudian. There was such thing. Um, how do you reconcile the whole thing about the whole motives behind signaling with the fact that one interpretation of Freud would be that he argued that people are always striving to pretty much like not be, right? That was the whole like the death drive, right? Um, so is that so in what way can you signal the fact that there is a deep drive inside of you that pretty much wants to not be and just not exist?
I can't claim to have immersed myself in a lot of Freudian thought. And I know it's the sort of thing that you do need to immerse yourself into if you want to have intelligent comments on things like this. It's not a simple thing. It's full of complicated layers and ambiguous terms and all sorts of things. So I will just say I don't know exactly what Freud meant or whether he was right. On death, there is this sort of psychology literature saying that we have this innate fear of death and it drives a lot of our behavior. And that even though we don't feel like we're afraid of death, this fear of death shows up in many particulars. That was a hidden motive that I read about and thought I would look for. But honestly, I can't say that I've found it that much, but it still might be there in other things I don't see. What I noticed was that, say, with respect to medicine, people were a lot less afraid of death than I would have thought. They're really just more terrified about being nonconformist than they are about dying, honestly. With respect to medicine, you would think people terrified of death would like check on what their doctor said and look up other things and get second opinions and also, and sort of ask, does that make any sense? And walk through the argument for these treatments they're supposed to get. And they don't do any of that. They really seem to just, oh, my doctor said to do this, and he seems to be a prestigious person. I'll just do that. And my life will depend on whether he's right. And people are just terrified of nonconformity, about seeming to be not trusting their doctor. They're just more interested in this prestige affiliation they have with this very prestigious doctor than they do with whether or not they're going to live or die, which is strange. But yeah, I guess in the past, they never lived or died so much on the basis of such things. We have this enormous deference toward prestige and wanting to affiliate with prestige, and this just seems to be much stronger a drive than not dying. Maybe if there was a knife right in front of us with blood on it, that would trigger our not dying instinct more. But when there's just sitting next to a doctor who's giving you abstract medical advice, seems not to be triggered very much at all. Your first question was about social media. So our first event here was about cultural evolution. And I've just come to respect this idea that our worlds are complicated cultural worlds, and that once upon a time, they were just carefully evolved over a long time with a lot of selection pressures to produce structures that worked. And that had a lot of parts. So when you were a peasant in a village, interacting with somebody who might trust you, you had all this bandwidth of all these, how much you're sweating and how you smell and whether you're fiddling with your fingers and just your tone of voice and your energy. All these little things are coming through in this vast high bandwidth communication. And so they don't have to be that clever or precise to roughly get the gist of it because it's so redundant. And then, in the context you're in, you had so many interactions with so many people that they didn't have to be that accurate about it because they would just converge on a rough estimate of things through, hundreds of people in the area interacting with each other decade after decade. I think various signals just got through pretty robustly because they had such wide bandwidth interactions repeated by so many people over such a long time with such redundant connections that it just all worked. And then in the last few decades, we've made huge changes to our world, huge changes to who we meet and how we interact and what sort of bandwidth connections we have. And my highest level, opinion is just we can't be very confident that that's working well because we've made far more changes than we could have possibly disciplined by cultural selection. So cultural evolution is just this very simple natural selection process where we try different things and the ones that don't work die. And the ones that don't die persist, and we're full of the descendants of ancestors who didn't die. And that's how we inherited all our culture. That's it. There's no other more special process that made our culture work than that selection process, which is pretty crude. And if you turn off selection pressures and you turn down variety and you just crank up the rate at which you change stuff, you just can't have much confidence that that's all in a, complicated arrangement that works well. I think you just have to expect, not because of anything particular about social media, just the mere fact of high rates of change of important stuff where the change isn't disciplined by selection, then we just got to expect lots and lots of stuff is going wrong, which I agree isn't very helpful advice because you want to know, well, gee, what can I do about this? If you had some more specific theory, we could say, oh, well, you need more interaction with people on social media, or they need to see each other's faces, or, they need to talk about religion, something. Then you'd have a more fix you could do. But if I just say it's because we have weak selection pressure, you say, what? We need more death? And I go, maybe. I don't have a better fix. Sorry. We turned off this machine that was, running humanity for a million years, and we've been drifting into dysfunction as a result. And yeah, it's a difficult situation. I don't have an easy fix.
I would add that cultural evolution gets rid of experiments that don't work, but then some crypto companies raising money for it right now. There's always somebody who wasn't informed that it didn't work, and maybe we should not try to reinvent it. I love this note on, first of all, the Freudian death wish is a heavily contested idea, and we have very little research to indicate that might be true in the way that Freud explained it. I think, Robin, your explanation is much closer to the truth, which is that we are conformists as a species. That was probably our kind of power, genetic power through selection, that more conformists survived. I often think about executions. Like, we have accounts of executions where they literally tell the person, just like, behave yourself. And imagine somebody tells you to behave yourself 5 minutes before they blow your brains out or like cut your head off, and you just do. Like, that makes zero sense. But probably the prestige of the doctor. I mean, in the Magic Mountain, the Thomas Mann book, there's a similar scene where there's an account of the TB patients being very dynamic and active all the way up to the last minute of their lives. And sometimes they are kicking and screaming, and the doctor is summoned just to tell the patient to be still and die. And then the patient obeys. It's, the healing. Any other questions on signals, Freud, ourselves? I'm going to stop for a second. And I'm glad that Sebastian figured out his audio. We were worried about you. Scott, any questions from Australia? From what I imagine is a very early morning.
Well,
it's about
go ahead.
Just after 8 in the morning here. So yeah, sort of taking it all in for now. But yeah, it's been very fascinating so far.
Well, maybe I should try to raise the stakes here by trying to say just how different your real motives are from your apparent motives. because you will doubt me in many of these claims. So, for example, on medicine, we have randomized trials of medicine that basically suggest that giving people more medicine doesn't make them healthier. That's one of the key data points about medicine, is that in fact, on average, people who get more medicine are not healthier. We have a bunch of randomized experiments of that sort. So when we're saying, why are you going to the doctor? You might say, maybe to get well, but on average, that's not working. So I think John asked the question earlier about can't we have part of our motives here? Of course. So think of a child who, once he didn't do their homework and they come to school and they have an excuse. They're going to say, the dog ate my homework, not the dragon ate my homework. Because dogs sometimes do eat homework and dragons don't. So whatever excuses we're going to have about our behavior, it has to be a plausible excuse that sometimes is true. It wouldn't work as an excuse if it weren't plausibly sometimes true. That's going to be true of all of our hidden motives, where all of the things we say we're doing make sense because sometimes it does make sense for that to be part of our motives. Same way for going to school. We do learn some things at school. We do sometimes want to learn some things at school. So that makes it a plausible excuse to go to school. But as my colleague Brian Kaplan explains in his book, The Case Against Education, on average, we don't really learn very much that's useful. And what we do learn, we don't remember, even though we're very eager to hire people with more education. So that's another sort of dramatic claim here. Mostly education isn't actually making better workers or better citizens. It's mostly just a way to distinguish people who can handle some things better than others. Medicine mostly just doesn't work in terms of making you healthier. Conversation, we basically say, look, what you're really doing in conversation mostly is just playing this game where the conversation is supposed to wander randomly, and then wherever it goes, you're supposed to have something interesting to say. You have this mental backpack of tools and resources, and your job is just to pick out something relevant to the topic. And if you can do that, that's a good proof that you're a good associate, because whatever situation you might be in, they'll just have lots of interesting things in their backpack to bring out in order to, apply. But in, ordinary small talk, you're not supposed to talk about something important. You're supposed to talk about trivial things. And nobody's supposed to control the conversation. It's just supposed to go on its own randomly. Why would we do that? Why talk about unimportant things and not bother to control it? Because it's this game of showing that you can, in fact, have relevant things to say about whatever comes up. Politics, a claim is that you actually don't care much about the country and the city and whether it's better off. What you mainly care about is showing your loyalty to your tribe. And that's mainly what you do by voting and talking politics, etc. And that's true of pretty much everyone. And we do achieve that. And that's in some sense why politics doesn't work very well to actually make the country, etc., better, because we're not trying to do that. When we figure out something that would just make everybody better and everybody would be in favor of it, it has almost no energy. People don't want to talk about that. They don't want to think about it. They are energized by the fights, by the ways in which our group differs from their group, and we have an opinion different from theirs, and we're going to fight them, and we are bound together by our shared fight. And certainly, this few weeks before the election, I hope you can all see this very vividly in the world around you. People are very motivated primarily about the fights, the ways in which we disagree with them, they're wrong, we're right. And there's very little energy or interest in sort of things we could all do to make everything better for everybody. Like changing political structures or institutions or things like that, better promoting innovation, etc. If the other people haven't taken a bad stance on that, who cares? Because how are you supposed to beat on them about their bad stance if you can't find a bad stance on it? If it's just something everybody would agree with, then nobody cares. So I'm trying to raise the stakes here and say, in all through your lives, you're all typically assuming you know why you're doing things, and that's motivating you, but you are just wrong about what's important about school, about medicine, about politics, about charity, about even consumption and conversation, even body language. That's the stakes that we're offering in this book, is that big chunks of your life, you are just wrong about why you're doing stuff and what's important.
And there's a lot of first of all, it's complicated, right? Like Robin is not saying that if you have a, toothache or a weird growth on your body, you shouldn't go to the doctor. You should. We're talking about kind of like GP level interactive doctoring, where probably just like, staying in bed for 3 days would do the trick. And you just feel better because you're being attended to. And also politics, like I would imagine that most people like have some care about the future, particularly their own personal future and the future of their children. Nobody wants their house to burn down, and their kids not to be able to go to university, to kind of make it more circular. But in the moments of heat, the heat of the moment, that's not what's in the forefront. And if your opponent would happen to bring up something that would make your house not burn down, you might counterintuitively oppose that idea, even though that would be helpful, because your motivations are complicated, right? So you're not saying that people should not go to the doctor, just like to be a little bit more moderate with the whole prestige angle of it, right?
So I have an essay that I did for a Cato conversation where the thesis was cut medicine in half. So I might say a simple heuristic is just do half as much medicine as you do. And when I had a discussion with Scott Alexander, I gave 4 different metrics by which you could use to pick half. And Scott said, yeah, that makes sense. You're right. Basically.
May I follow up very, very quickly, concisely? Robin, I hear you saying that we're signaling furiously everywhere and always, but because selection pressures in culture have become weaker, the signaling is less functional. It's more like sound and fury, noise signifying nothing. Is that a fair encapsulation of where I'm trying to put together different pieces of your research program in a nutshell.
2 levels of these things. There's at a personal level, you signal to get personal advantages of having people like you less and hate you, like you more, hate you less, things like that. And then at a larger social level, there's society has status markers, what's important. It has norms. It has, standard practices like going to school. And at these social level, this package of standard practices and norms can be productive and functional or dysfunctional. But whichever one they are, at the personal level, you're still going to be doing what's in your personal interest, but it just will add up to less useful collective result if culture hasn't put it together in a useful package. So the claim is that at the individual level, you're all signaling furiously, and this is giving you the personal benefits, roughly, in terms of making people like you more and hate you less, etc. But it's less adding up to a coherent functional culture because that has just been degrading over time. So, for example, once upon a time, education was very useful. And in the early years of spread of education, it was spreading because it was adaptive. That is, places that had more education were winning, and people wanted to copy that. But now, centuries later, with weak selection pressures, we've just drifted into having way too much education. At the individual level, you are well advised to get education. If you don't, you will personally suffer. But collectively, the equilibrium is not very helpful for us as a group.
And Dimitri has a really good point in the chat. And I would like to kind of go into the sacred a little bit more, although we have touched upon it, because it's interestingly related to Dimitri, your point, which is that, these days we write a lot about the sacred, but the book, Elephant in the Brain, is full of debunking entire areas that we consider sacred, right? Like education, medicine, charity. And I'm wondering, why do you think that us readers, like I feel that I do benefit from knowing more about my personal motivations and my hidden agendas, but what it is to you on a societal level where you think we gain from understanding our instincts around the sacred and our hidden motivations more if we have more scientific information about them?
So I'm a professor of economics, and I inherited the academic tradition of believing that it was noble and valuable to go figure stuff out about important things. So naturally, in that mode, I went out to try to figure out important things. And I saw these signs that maybe were wrong about our motives. And the obvious thing for me to do was to dig in to figure out, okay, well, what are our real motives? Because, of course, that's what you do as a 21st century intellectual. You try to figure out the world and try to tell people honestly what you figured out. Then if you think about
truth sets you free, right?
Well, no, this truth is just the assumption. Like we're just in this assumption that we should be digging up the truth and that that's valuable socially and that we will get personal accolades and prestige from it. So as intellectuals, we are just in the momentum habit of trying to figure out the truth. But if you think about it more carefully and try to understand academia, you will realize that in fact, academia doesn't always reward the truth. In fact, sometimes it suppresses the truth. And that in fact, we as humans might be built not to know some things, and that might be in our interest. So it's not obvious, in fact, that we should always want to know the truth, or that it's even good for academics to uncover truths. It might be true on average, it might not, but as academics, we just assume that we are very sort of part of our ideology that we should be discovering truth. And so I wrote this book and the blog posts that precede this on the usual academic momentum of course, I should try to figure out what's important and tell everybody, right? But then, having nearly completed the book, we had to write a conclusion where we said, okay, was this a good thing? Should we be trying to figure out this truth? And should we be trying to tell people? And we had to admit, I'm not so sure about that. And so we retreated to a stance of saying, okay, well, if anybody should know the truth, it's the following people. And if you're one of them, maybe you should be reading our book. The rest of you guys go away. So, okay, who's that list? Who are the people who should know? Okay, look, first of all, we social scientists talk about, reforming education and reforming medicine and reforming politics and charity. And we're doing all this talk about how to do that as if we understood those things. So if we're going to continue in that enterprise, we should pay the cost to figure out what the hell is actually going on or quit the whole thing. I mean, there's not that much point in talking about how to reform things if you aren't willing to figure out how they actually work. So with the momentum of presuming, yeah, somebody should be trying to figure out how to reform things, then fine, somebody should be figuring out what the truth is. And if you're a policy analyst or social scientist and you have aspirations to reform the world to make it better about things like this, then yeah, it's your job. Suck it up, learn the truth, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it doesn't make your personal life go better, because it's your job and you signed up for it. You can quit the job if you want, but this is the job. Okay, that's not most of the readers of our book. We got to admit, they're not mostly policy analysts or social science. So who else should know this stuff? Okay. Number two, there are basically, you were born with an instinct not to know stuff. And evolution, cultural and biological, made that assumption about you. And it's probably right unless your context has changed substantially since when evolution made those judgments. So the question is your life so different from what evolution anticipated that it might be worth your being different than what evolution planned for you in terms of ignorance about this stuff? And some categories of people that make some sense are maybe salespeople or managers for whom it's especially important to know the people around them and what actually motivates them and what actually would motivate them and why they're actually doing stuff. Management and sales is primarily about motivation. So if you don't understand how people are motivated, how can you do a decent job of sales or management? Because that's your job. That's the whole thing. So those people may well want to understand people's real motives. And so, for example, you look at marketing people do seem to know a fair bit about how real motives differ from stated motives, and that seems to be important for their job. And I think they know a lot there. I think that's not all bullshit. I think they actually do know a lot about motives. And same for managers when they're talking privately among each other, which is different than what they say to other people. Of course, different from what marketers say to their customers. They lie a lot there, but they know they're lying. And so, okay, fine. Another category, the third category is some of us do not glide smoothly through the social world on our instincts. We are called nerds, autists, whatever you want to call us. We are not socially competent. We inherited all our genes and social schooling and culture, and we still are awkward in the social world around us. So then, and some of us are actually pretty good at thinking about things, even if we're intuitively pretty socially awkward. So for those people, that seems to be the best gamble of, okay, you might want to actually think about stuff and figure out how the world around you works and have a conscious theory in your mind about your motives and other people's so that you don't step on people's toes so much in your social interactions. Yes, you will lose this benefit of being this authentic, intuitive, spontaneous person who just goes with your gut. That won't be you, but that wasn't you before anyway. It wasn't working. Maybe this other thing will work for you. So that's what I've got there. And I have to admit, it's not that strong a justification for people to read the book. But here's the saving grace, I think. If you look at something and you realize that's not really in my interest to know, you are really quite capable of looking the other way and forgetting it. This is just a widespread human capacity. Just turn it off, walk away, watch some TV, listen to a song, talk to a friend. Just forget it. It's easy to just forget stuff. People do it all the time.
I love it. I think there are more groups of people than you. I think you were very conservative there, but I agree with this list. I would add probably 10 more to it, or basically anybody. I'm really pleased to have a partner in my thinking that observing other people is the way of learning about oneself, and it's kind of missing from the literature these days. There's a lot of navel gazing.
Right. But do you want to know yourself? That's the question. Like people make this assumption, of course I want to understand myself better, but it's not obvious you do. Evolution's hiding some stuff from you about yourself, and maybe it's right to hide that stuff.
And that's where I wanted to get to at this point, because you outline benefits. I mean, not just evolutionarily, but why these characteristics have stayed with us, and even some social norms don't make them fully disappear. So what are the benefits of hiding things from ourselves and other people? And what might have been, a situation 100,000 years ago when hiding something from ourselves or others made sense, but it no longer does, and what might have been something that survived?
So people often want to trust each other by their sort of intuitive subsystems trusting each other without their conscious thought getting in the way. So people get drunk with each other, for example, or other stressful situations or ways where they can't consciously manage exactly because what they want is their subconsciouses to meet and interact and get along.
Or they go into each other's houses, eat each other's the food that people eat.
Right.
So like your
exactly. And like many business deals have happened because people got together for an evening and had drinks and food and just got to know each other, right? And the law also is more severe on people who do things consciously than unconsciously. And in general, when somebody is consciously planning something very emotional and important about you, that's just suspicious to most people. We have this concept of authenticity, which is primarily that you shouldn't be too consciously planning about certain key important interactions and behaviors. That's authenticity doesn't mean it's the real you. There is no real you. The authentic you changes over time as you practice various things. Nevertheless, it's important that people want to trust you on the basis of seeing that you're not very calculating about your interactions with them. And that's the benefit of not knowing the elephant in the brain and not thinking consciously about that, is that you were built to show each other who you are and that they can trust you through your intuitive unconscious behavior. You were built to read that on them and decide whether you can trust them based on that. You all have these deep machines inside you that are all ready to do these things and read these things on other people. And then if you intervene in that with your conscious plans, that really puts a lot of people off because they're suspicious that that could only be, trying to manipulate you or trying to trick you. And that's why people are wary about seeming to be too manipulative, too transactional, to what, et cetera, bad names for trying to think through how you interact.
There's a theory in evolutionary biology that the human face is so expressive, and our eyes evolved the sclera, the white of the eye, which the other primates don't have, right? They have button eyes, so that you can be more expressive, so that people can see who you are looking at. I mean, facially, we are baby chimps, right? Like we mated until we made everybody look like a baby because we like the symmetry and that it's very expressive, that we have large eyes, large, like trust me, right? I'm not, and our gestures, that Steven Pinker has a whole talk on, like
Right.
we are trying to gain each other's trust all the time and look very innocent. We are trading a trading species.
But the modern world has selected for the exceptions, the sociopaths, the psychopaths, the just very actors, basically, people who can pretend and be apparently sincere and authentic while actually calculating. Those are the people who dominate, management and sales and high ends of many professions, because they can, in fact, do both.
I mean, that's the winning of
and they can also calculate.
Yeah. You inherit the outlines of an innocent, but you have the the hidden agenda as well.
And so that's a strange thing about our world, and we haven't fully realized how that plays out when we consistently have people winning at our world by evading these historic, defenses against people being manipulative. So, advertising, sales, propaganda speeches, the presidential candidates make a speech which has the very best speechwriters spending days putting the speech together, and we're treating it as if it was some spontaneous, talk of somebody near us, and we're just outclassed in our ability to evaluate and dig through that. And that's a big part of the modern world, is that our ordinary intuitional abilities to judge other people and their sincerity and their agendas and things like that, we're just outclassed by having very high-powered, high-skilled, high-resource professionals put a lot of work into selling this stuff.
Sebastian, you have your mic on. Do you have a question?
I do have a question. Sorry for whatever mic issues I've had earlier.
Yeah, it was just like you were dropping in and out, but I'm glad it's working now.
Okay. So I have a question then. Like, Robin, you would think then that politicians are very good at signaling one thing but being another. But sometimes, at least in democratic societies, we find ourselves surprised that politicians are the thing that they say they are. It might be good in our eyes or bad, but we tend to be surprised about sometimes their lack of guile. Like, they say what their campaign is and they try and do things on their campaign. This seems to happen too often. Or
Right.
maybe those things, like, it seems to happen too often.
So think about a movie. You see this actor on the screen reading these lines in the situation with tears in their eyes, perhaps trembling voice. Behind them is a director and a script writer and a whole industry that put that person in front of you. If you look at that person and say, do I believe those tears? Well, you do. And you think, how clever could this person I'm seeing in front of me be to calculate the lines he's saying and the tears he's putting? I don't believe this one person is that clever. I think this actor is method acting and really feels these lines at this moment. But that doesn't mean you should trust that. That's because this actor has this whole industry behind them to produce that situation. The same way for a politician, the politician might be the most believable and, engageable and feeling trustworthy when they in fact believe what they're saying, but they're part of a system that put them there and that will manage them behind the scenes when you're not looking. And it's the whole system you should be worried about, not that person in front of you. It's the same for the actor. If you wonder whether you can trust a movie and its impression it's giving you, you shouldn't be asking, do I trust the actor? Would that man lie to me? No, Mel Gibson would never lie to me. I trust him completely. So this movie couldn't possibly be deceptive. I mean, he might not lie to you. He might be that sort of person. You see him in an interview, he might be completely sincere, but he has put himself in a system that lets them tell him what to say and when to say it and how. And the same for politicians. The reason you should not trust a politician isn't because you looked in their eyes like, I guess what, and you say, I trust them from looking in their eyes. I mean, that's apparently what Trump said to Putin or something, right? But look, both of them are on show for all the rest of us. And it's not about them personally at all. The whole point is like, if they've got you to ask, do I trust this person? They've already won because this is the person they put in front of you and they're hiding the whole system behind them. And that's the whole misdirection, is to focus on this one person.
Meisner's definition of acting is being truthful in an imaginary situation. There you go. I would love to talk about selfishness as kind of the coda of our salon. Since the book came out and now I was revisiting it, I had read Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness. And I'm curious what you think about Ayn Rand in general. I know that in our community, we have some Randians, but also whether you feel that selfishness is a kind of special category when it comes to our hidden motivations or hidden agendas, because we seem to want to hide that from ourselves and also from others, maybe the most. Would you agree with that? And if so, what makes selfishness so special?
So clearly our ancestors put a lot of weight on trying to read the motives of people around them in the category of selfishness versus not. That was apparently a useful and important category to read the people around them. And so, that would certainly make sense in terms of like somebody's making a deal, or they trying to cheat you or not, or somebody suggesting you marry their daughter or whatever it is, right? We often had enough context where the selfish theory wasn't this abstract selfishness. It was a particular concern of selfishness in that context. And it was contrasted with another concern that might also be plausibly more pro-social. And we had, those theories in our mind that we were debating about a particular person. And we often talked about selfishness as a way to describe that inference problem we had about particular people. Like a stranger comes into town, can you trust them? For example, is about, are they really just going to rob us and kill us? Or, are they going to lie? Do they ever plan to come back and have a long-term relationship, etc.? Those were important inferences to make about people around them, and they were relevant. And so this inference about, are people selfish, was a very powerful, important heuristic and strategy to use in our ancestral worlds to make judgments about people that we dealt with. Projected into the modern world, though, altruistic versus selfish is this pretty abstract category that can project into specific things in so many different ways. And then we have many kinds of relationships where it's actually not that relevant, where we still project it on. So for example, when you go to the grocery store and, want to buy stuff there, and should you trust it, it's really not about how selfish is the grocery store owner or you for that matter. There's just these other more important things that matter in that interaction. And, we economists say basically there's a lot of ways the modern world can work just great for everybody, including you, even if people are pretty selfish in many ways. And so this selfish altruistic heuristic is just not that relevant, at least in the way we're assuming, for a lot of our interactions in the modern world. But it is still pretty relevant for your spouse or your child or, your lover or your friend. There are many relationships in our world where that is relevant and it is worth making that inference. But even then, we often make trade-offs. If you have like a sports team and you have somebody else on your team, you're often making a choice between someone who's a little bit of a selfish asshole, who's a better player, versus someone else who's very kind and considerate, but not such a good player. And you make choices there, and you'll choose the asshole because it's a reasonable choice to make. It's not like, so sometimes we present it as if it's this all or nothing. Like, of course you would want always the altruistic person, but no. That's certainly in the modern world, it's one consideration among many. And sometimes it's even a bad sign. There are certainly some contexts where someone seeming to be excessively altruistic is just a bad sign about the role they want to be in. For example, I don't know, a trader, a Wall Street trader. When you're interviewing a Wall Street trader and the guy seems really nice, you're going to go, no, it's not what we're looking for here. Go teach high school or something. But, here we need vicious wolves. And that's what we want to pick here. They won't get along with each other fine. There'll be some fights over who stole the lunch from somebody's fridge or whatever, but still, we need those people here.
And then, but we also retroactively rejudge people, right? Like if somebody stole, somebody stole a loaf of bread, boo, oh, it's for his hungry children. Oh, that's so cute. I think we talked about it, about extramarital affairs at one of the other salons. Like we judge so differently people who are in love versus people who are just around, because it seems to be a nicer.
Right, that's how we basically take sacred purposes as if they were altruistic, but in fact, they aren't necessarily that connected. But if we say love is sacred, so they were doing it for love, we say, oh, well, that's excusable, but it's not altruistic exactly.
Absolutely. But I love how it feels like all roads here literally lead to Rome. When was the moment when the sacred became so important to you? I'm so curious about that shift.
Well, see, much of my intellectual life is starting out with these simple assumptions that seem to be defied by the world and trying to make sense of that. So one is just, say, looking at medicine or education and seeing all these puzzles. But another big part of my life was like inventing solutions to things and seeing people not really very interested in them. Because I'm very proud of, if you took the usual assumptions about what things are for and what we want them to do, I've invented ways the world could just be much better if only we would adopt some of these inventions. And then the world just doesn't seem interested in. And so that's this big data point making me go, okay, like clearly I'm missing something really important here if the world is not interested in these things that they should be interested if what they've said can be believed. So, prediction markets were, I guess, the first big thing like that for me, where it looked really obvious, it was really powerful, and the world was just not that interested. And I was going, but why? And it made me a clear data point that, look, most organizations are saying some things about their motives and their agendas that are just not true. And, again, so that was happening at the same time for me as noticing that health policy could be better understood in terms of this sort of signaling motives. And, the more examples I saw, the more I was willing to look in more places for these sorts of explanations of behavior. People are just not telling the truth about why they do things. But it's still hard for me, I have to say, like inside me, there's this same intuition the rest of you have that of course I go to the doctor to get well, and of course I'm at school to learn things, and of course I give to charity to help, and of course I vote to make the country better. I mean, it's what we all assume about ourselves, and I want to assume the best about me. And so it's hard for me to like look at me from the outside and say, that's what you think, but no. I think, well, look, I'm seeing myself from the inside. How could this outside view know better than what I feel from the inside?
You want to be self-honest and understand why you're doing things, right? I mean,
I thought I did, but I have to realize, no, I mean, honestly,
it's bad enough to find out that you misunderstood somebody.
I do all of this on the assumption of course, I want to know the truth. Of course, I'm an intellectual whose whole job is to figure out the important truths about things. So of course, I want to know. And then I find out truths and I stare at them and I have to ask myself, did I want to know that?
You did.
Not obvious. I do. No, it's not obvious.
Yes, you did. I like to think that all good nonfiction books come from this frustration. Not true. What these other people are saying is not true. But my other comment, and then I'm going to go back to Eloy, is Umberto Eco wrote his first novel, The Name of the Rose, at your age. So that was his first novel. So, there's a way to build a world where you do whatever you want. It's called fiction. And the characters just have to do what you want them to do. Maybe that's going to
Right.
be
So,
a new
so
project.
I have to notice that. So in this book, we took 10 areas of life, and for each area, we found a hidden motives. But it's quite obvious that you could have another 40 areas of life and do the same exercise there. So we showed you how to do this, i.e., how to take an area of life, find the usual motive people say, look for the clues that might indicate another motive, and find the other motive. If all of you in the world were that eager to find out more hidden motives, you would be doing this already. You would just have heard about this and go, wow, this is great. I'm going to go do this. And hardly anybody has done that. That is, you guys don't want to know either.
That's Robin, because you've never been in a room where only women are talking. What we are talking about is, why did he said that to him, her, what, and what that? It's 4D chess.
Right. But asking about your own motives is a little harder than what his motives
Yeah,
are.
that's harder. That's harder. Eloy, a quick question to you.
Sure. Just a very quick thing. So, if people are not interested in fixing problems and assuming that a problem can only go as long as it can, so what would be the optimal way to fix the problem? Just to wait until everything falls off? Like, what is so? Because the thing is that right now, like, I can tell you, like, there's a few things that are like happening all around the world. I'll put a very very concrete example. Like, there is right now in a country that I forget. I don't want to remember the name of that country. There is a discussion right now, a very serious discussion about social security, right? And the thing is that if there is not a plan to save social security, this is not the US, by the way. And over the next month or two, the money is going to run out, right? And the problem has been going on for 10 years. And again, like taking for granted that that people just don't want to solve it because it's a matter of signaling, it's a matter of like. So what prompts people to just say, hey, we need to just fix this thing because then nobody's going to get their paychecks?
So people have these theories in their head about what their motives are and what their priorities are and what their relationships are. And the simplest thing to do is to frame this problem in those terms, and then people can more accept an analysis of those terms, which might drive them to take action. But in addition, people just have this habit, unfortunately, which is people are not interested in proposals for change that don't come from elites. Ordinary people are just not eligible to make such proposals. Change is a coordination, and people coordinate around elites taking an initiative. And so you need to have some elite who is the leader, seen as the leader of a change initiative. And then people might rally around them if they feel compatible enough with them, and if their explanation is framed enough in the usual terms. So unfortunately, if you need to understand the hidden motives to explain the problem, people are not going to be very open to even accepting that there is a problem there. So you'll need to find a way typically to explain the problem in the terms people are willing to accept, i.e. those corrupt politicians have been lying to us all along and now we're out of money. What are we going to do? I mean, that's a story people often are willing to listen to, not like we've been lazy and selfish and spending too much. That may be not the story they want to hear about themselves. So it's harder to make, the analysis in those terms. And then you'll need the sort of initiatives that you're going to do to fix this also fit the stories people usually tell about the kinds of processes there are in the world that work. And again, if your real processes differ from that, you'll have to find a way to re-describe it so that it fits their usual narratives. But then in addition, you will need to have prestigious people they respect who are the leaders of this change initiative, because that's who are people willing to follow. And without them, there will be no initiative because we don't follow ordinary people in big change initiatives. That's not how it works.
Thank you so much, Robin. And thank you everybody for coming. This has been fascinating. Do reread or read Elephant in the Brain. I think it's one of the books. Yay! This is a promotion salon. It's a book that I think will be read for a long time to come. And many of the, I mean, this is what was so fascinating to me, that whilst I understand from a historical perspective, because I remember that era of the internet, that this is a kind of crown jewel of that era, and it recaps it, but it is not really tied to it. And you know, we oftentimes no longer remember scenes or sceneuses in retrospect in 100 years, but we do remember the great works of that period. And I'm so happy that you guys wrote this, Kevin and Robin. And I hope that not only your listed categories will find it useful, but everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I think the next salon in this series is in a month. And I know that, Robin, you're a very prolific X or Twitter user. And so if anybody wakes up tomorrow morning and realizes that you forgot to ask your big question, I'm sure if you tweet at Robin or him, he will oblige you with an answer. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. And Robin, this is fascinating. And these sacred professions need you to like keep them in check a little bit. And probably half of every one of them would be better for everybody, except for them. But you know, it's their problem. Thank you for being here. I will see you next time. Take care. Thank you. Good night or day and morning to Scott in Australia.